We're back. We're live.
Yay!
It's Wine Wednesday. Is that right?
Frickin' 3 weeks in a row.
I know. This is like a regular show now. But this is a very special Wine Wednesday, Wine of the
It is.
Week. And but before I get into that, I just want to mention thanks to everybody that's joined us so far. Thanks for spreading the word and inviting your friends. And I want to remind everybody, if you like the show, or even if you don't, I don't really care, hit the follow button and the like button, because that really helps us kind of, it really motivates us to keep doing
Right.
this and come back.
And if you're supposed to, if you're on our Facebook, then you're our friends, and friends are supposed to help friends out. So,
especially
just like it, follow it. We're
in
not
these
asking a
trying
lot.
times. No, that's exactly right. Follow it, spread it, share it, annoy people with links. That's what the internet is for. So, speaking
And
of
cat
the internet,
pictures. That and cat pictures.
indeed. There's my cat right there. Okay, so for this week, something a little different, something a little special. There was actually some sad news in the world of wine this week. And if you follow wine at all or you know anything about it, you'll know the name Stephen Spurrier. And he's kind of a celebrity in the wine world, as much as there are celebrities in the wine world.
And he's not the coach. If we
Right.
could just
Different Stephen
get that out
Spurrier.
there.
Right, correct. Not the coach, the football coach, but in fact a British wine merchant who really, just to keep it short, he really helped put Napa Valley on the map as a wine region. So what we're going to do, kind of in honor of him, is we're going to talk about Napa Valley today and some of the Napa Valley wines and how that became such an important region in the wine world. And maybe even taste a couple of them. Sounds like a plan?
I think so.
I
I
don't
think
know.
so.
A couple of people told me they were excited to hear about Napa Valley because it's such a big name and there's so much stuff from there. It can be a little expensive, and we'll talk about why that is. But let's jump into it and see if we can at least learn something. So,
Yes.
super famous wine region. We're only going to touch kind of the tip of the iceberg on this, just go into real high level stuff here. But it really started out as the kind of the Wild West in American winemaking. Really back in the 19th century, but the premium winemakers didn't really show up till probably around the 1950s or 60s, really. But there were still a couple old families there that really started it out. And what they discovered was this climate that's very similar to the Mediterranean. So, the wines of Spain and Italy and Greece. It's kind of a coastal desert climate out there. And they found out that the soils there are just perfect for growing grapes. But like I said, a very Wild West attitude of experimentation, no regulations, no traditions for thousands of years like you have in the old world in France and these other countries. And so they're really kind of, motivated to experiment and try new things and not be, beholden to, the old ways. And that's kind
Now,
of
where did the vines come from that they grew out there?
well, mostly they came from France. These are French grapes that really they grow in California. So, they brought those over and sometimes would graft them with American rootstock and they would plant these. So there are some grapes that are really American or considered American grapes, like Zinfandel is a really good example of one. But but Napa Valley itself is really known for its Cabernet Sauvignon and its Chardonnay, which are both French grapes. So this whole kind of Wild West, no rules thing is both good and bad because experimentation, you can come up with cool new ideas and new wines, but it also confuses the consumer a lot. You can it's very hard to actually go to find Napa Valley wines and know what's going to be good and what's not going to be good.
Right.
And it's hard to experiment too because the prices tend to be really high.
Right.
So everybody knows some of the big names in wine out there. Maybe everybody knows, maybe everybody doesn't know, like Beringer and Mondavi and BV and Mayacamas, Farniente, Stag's Leap. These are kind of the big name Cabernets that you'll find if you
Right.
go to any wine shop in the country, big or small.
Right.
You
But
know,
there are like thousands of wineries out there.
California has an insane number of wineries. Napa Valley itself, I think it's between 500 and 600 producers.
Just in Napa Valley.
Right, and maybe about 400, 450 of them actually grow grapes there, which is a huge number. So Napa Valley is a true valley. It sits between these two mountain ranges in California, about an hour north of San Francisco, between the Mayacamas and the Vaca. And on the other side of the Mayacamas mountain range is Sonoma as you head towards the Pacific Ocean. And so that's kind of the relationship there, geographically. But like I said, it's about an hour north of San Francisco by car. And it's got a very, like I said, Mediterranean climate. It is hot and it's dry. And the valley floor, it can get up to 105 degrees during the summer, which I can tell you is not, grapes don't really like that. It's too hot. But the nights are mild, and the cool air comes in and helps balance things out. Now, on the rocky slopes on the sides of the valley, the grapes struggle to grow through the rocks and the hillsides, but grapes like that. That actually results in really concentrated flavors and things, and winemakers look for that. And so, the grapes on the valley floor, they get super ripe because of all the sun and the heat. And so what they end up doing is most of the time blending grapes from these different areas and coming up with the right balance for the wine. But it's tricky. You have to be pretty skilled in winemaking to be able to grow good grapes and make good wine in Napa Valley. And I think that's part of the reason that the prices tend to be high, is because it takes a lot of skill. And so good winemakers, skilled winemakers go there, and they're expensive, and the grapes themselves are expensive. So that's part of it. And of course, the other part of the expense is that Napa Valley is a big brand name. So a lot of these 600 wineries are not really turning out very good wine necessarily, but they had enough money to buy some land there, or to put Napa Valley on the label. So, there's always that little cynical piece of it that I like to throw in there.
Right. Or it might be that some of those bigger names, in order to have premium level wines, or so you might have your lower level entry wines that are grown, or mixed grapes from other areas, but then they put a Napa Valley, out there, vintage out there, and up the price.
Yeah, and there's a lot of controversy. This is the problem with the American wine industry, is that you get there's so little regulation on it that there ends up being a lot of confusion. There are wineries in New York State that sell wine that says Napa Valley on the label because they buy the grapes from Napa and then they make the wine in New York. And there's lawsuits being thrown around because of this stuff, and people don't like it. It's kind of muddying the waters and the brand, and so it's just kind of tough. This stuff goes on all the time. You don't really have that problem over in the old world in Europe because of these centuries and centuries of strict regulations that are in place. So we get
and they actually, on the labels, if you look at like the French wines, they'll put on the label where it's from, the appellation or something, as opposed to the grape, or they're pretty specific in terms of where it comes from, and that's all very regulated over there.
Yeah. And to put that name on that label means you satisfied all these different criteria when it comes to farming and winemaking techniques and all this other stuff. So I mean, you can't just put Burgundy on your label if you want to. You have to actually pass all these tests in order to do that. In the United States, it's a lot more loosey-goosey, I guess is the right word for it. But anyway, nevertheless, Napa Valley is really recognized as having a very excellent and unique terroir for making wine. Terroir really is just one of those French words that doesn't have an English translation, but it really means like a combination of everything that contributes to the character of a wine that's not the humans, right? Not the winemaker.
Right.
So, the weather patterns and the soil composition and, all that stuff. And they recognized early on that Napa Valley really had the right combination of things to grow high quality grapes, if you're skilled enough to be able to deal with, the climate there.
Right.
So, it's one of the things that's also been challenging in the past few years are these wildfires that have come through.
Oh yeah.
All heard about that on the news. So, Napa Valley and Sonoma as well have just had these devastating wildfires that have come through. And, a lot of that's due to perhaps, the drier weather and climate change. And you can try and figure out, what causes all this stuff. But you always get funny questions. I talked to a couple different winemakers out there, and they're like, we always get this question, does all the smoke in the air, is that going to mean that the the wine from that year is going to have a smoky taste to it. Like, no, it means the grapes are ruined, is what it means.
It means you're not getting wine that year.
Exactly. So, anyway, I think it would be cool. We've got some wines of the week to look at. Wines, plural, by the way, 2 of them.
So exciting.
But I thought it'd be cool.
Twice the fun.
Yeah, that's right. It'd be cool if you could talk a little bit about how this sort of backwater wine lab area kind of turned into a world famous region in the first place.
Yes. And you kind of mentioned why it happened. I mean, it really can be tied to one man, the man, Stephen Spurrier, who we just lost. So it starts about 45 years ago when Stephen Spurrier was an English expat who lived in Paris, France, and he owned a wine shop there. And he also owned a private wine school. And he had a partner, or the person who was the director of the wine school, since he focused on the shop, was a woman named Patricia Gallagher, and she was an American. And so she was the director of this wine school, and had been open for a few years at this point. And she started noticing that more and more Americans or Californian winemakers were coming through the school, visiting the shop, talking to her, and she thought it was kind of interesting. She had been to Napa before, and she'd seen kind of the innovations that were happening there. And so it was actually Patricia's idea to hold a wine tasting between these new upstart California wines and the French wines.
Really?
And yes, it was. And now it was really just supposed to be a publicity stunt. I mean, it was just get some word out about the shop and the school. It was supposed to be fun and educational. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal.
Now, Patricia was French, right?
Patricia? No, she was American.
She was American. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So we have Steve Spurrier, who is English, and we have Patricia Gallagher, who's American, and living in Paris.
Right.
Okay, so
and
that's
this is back,
the setup.
And this is in the time when this is, the early 70s, when French wine is basically the standard for the world.
That's it. There's really no other wine. I mean, there's, some Italian wine and European wine. Europe was known for its wine. France, of course, was the standard, the gold standard. And there was just, at this point, even though winemaking, as you said, had been going on for probably 100 years in California and pretty hardcore for 20 years, it was just completely off the radar. Nobody had any idea about these wines. Nobody really tried these wines. It was just not even in anyone's thoughts at all, right? So Patricia suggested they do a fun little wine tasting. And it was a publicity thing. And it also was in 1976. So this was America's bicentennial. So it was a good kind of hook, a chance to say, oh, look, we'll try these American wines. It's with the bicentennial, it'll be fun, etc. So Patricia and Steve had been living in France for a while now, and they had a lot of contacts. So they were able to put together a judging panel of like the creme de la creme of the French wine world. I mean, these are incredibly well-known people, French wine connoisseurs, wine writers, all those people who were critics. Yeah, I mean, just well-known names at the time. And so they agreed to be the judges. Steve Spurrier went and collected some of the best wines in France they had to offer. I mean, we're talking Grand Cru Burgundies and First Growth Bordeaux. I mean, these were the top wines that he could find. Now, to be fair, he did go to Napa to select wines from California to go into the competition. And he did select wines that he thought were very good. He didn't want it to be like a bloodbath, although at this point, everyone knew that France was going to win. So it wasn't a problem with that. He just didn't want the Americans to have like a terrible showing. So he did go and he personally selected the wines and brought them back for the tasting. This is so exciting. This is great. So
just a publicity stunt.
Just a fun, educational, we'll introduce these little upstart wines. Eventually, maybe they'll be okay to like cook with, but that was pretty much the the thinking behind all of this. So it was May 24th, 1976. There was the wine tasting. It was held at the Intercontinental Hotel in Paris. We had 9 French judges, incredibly distinguished French judges. It was a blind tasting. Nobody knew what they were drinking before they were poured and rated.
Yes.
There were 10 white wines and 10 red wines. And the judges were to rate each wine out of 20 points. So you taste it, you rate it, but it was not based on anything. Like there was no description of what 20 points equaled.
Right.
It was just kind of a completely subjective. You taste it, you rate it. Okay, so the first category to be judged were the white wines. And so there were four French white Burgundies and 6 California Chardonnays. So those were the ones that were going to be tasted, those were the ones in the competition. So each wine was tasted and each wine was rated and the scores were tallied. And the winner of the competition, of the white competition, was the 1973 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay from Napa Valley.
There she is right there.
Not the same year, but
this is the 2018. I wasn't able to get my hands on a 73 or whatever it was, but yeah. So Chateau Montelena, so surprise winner, to say the least.
Yes.
Now, the French were fairly accepting of this result, I imagine.
Oh, yeah, they thought it was fine. Well, so at this point, and not only did Chateau Montelena win first place, 3 of the top 5 wines were California wines.
Wow.
So also not only the first, but the 3rd and the 4th ranked wines were also California Chardonnays.
In the white category. Okay.
Yeah. So at this point, Stephen Spurrier started to panic a little bit because he was living in France. He owned a wine shop in France. He owned a wine school in France. He had invited all these prominent French wine connoisseurs to be in his fun little judging tasting, and these were all his contacts. This was his life, and so now he's and he had never ever dreamed this was happen. Nobody did. In fact, there were wines from the California wines. There were winemakers who didn't even know their wines were in the competition. Like he just didn't tell them. He just bought the wines retail and brought them back. Right.
Yeah, why bother?
So this was alarming at this point. People were a little bit worried. So against the competition rules, Stephen Spurrier went and told the judges who won the white category. And this was done to kind of encourage them to work really hard to pick a French white or a French red out of the red wines. So they wanted a French winner out of the red wines. And so he went over and told them the results of the white category just to give them a little, nudge in that direction.
That is fantastic. But before we talk about those reds, let's just talk real briefly about the winner.
Okay.
So Chateau Montelena from Napa Valley. These guys, this winery actually started, it's pretty old. It started back in the 1800s. I think it was 1882. And it's located up in Calistoga in the north end. Up there you got volcanic soil. I love wines with volcanic soil, by the way. And so it's a little further away from the water, from the bay in the south. But Napa Valley Chardonnay has a very distinct flavor profile to it. They focus on fruit, and they focus on what we call secondary flavors, and those are flavors that happen during the winemaking process. So anytime you have a Napa Valley Chardonnay, you can take a look at that one right there. That's that Montelena in the glass. If I take a sniff of this, I get exactly what I'm expecting, which is number 1, I can smell the oak in there. And number 2, I can smell a little bit of butter. It's kind of like a dairy thing going on. Some people will liken this to movie theater popcorn butter. It's like that very smell you get from that very specific.
Yep.
I don't know if that's dairy necessarily, but that very specific kind of buttery smell from popcorn.
It's almost like a chemical butter, though. I mean, it's like a, yeah.
Oh, very much so. And it comes from a process called malolactic fermentation that is a choice the winemaker makes. And it's a fermentation that converts the malic acid into lactic acid in the wine. And that's where that dairy flavor comes from. Lactic acid, lactose, whatnot. So you get that in almost all Napa Valley or California Chardonnays in general, and you also definitely get the prominent oak. Otherwise, there's kind of nice citrusy and tropical flavors in it too. Like you'll often get lime. You can definitely smell that in here and taste it. And the hotter climate it comes from, maybe further south in Napa Valley, you're going to get more tropical flavors like pineapple or mango or something like that. But this is a pretty standard, textbook Napa Valley Chardonnay. Now,
right. And go ahead.
Granted,
I was going to say
the 2018 is probably a lot different than the early 70s vintage because winemaking practices and technology has changed so much. And unfortunately, I've never tasted that old one, but what you're going to get today, this is a kind of a classic representation of it.
Right, and that's a classic French making Chardonnay too. That buttery, the oaky, those deep flavors like that. And back in '76, that was definitely the style. I mean, what a white wine was expected to be. And so now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that wine style kind of went out of. I mean, it's not the popular drinking choice nowadays, or maybe it's coming baking back actually, but for a long time it was people were looking for crisper whites and non-oaked and things that were not quite as didn't have the prominent characteristics of the California Chardonnay.
Yeah, and in fact in the 1980s, and I think we talked about this on a show before, and
yeah,
in the 1980s,
I think we did.
The kind of success that came from Napa Valley in the 70s, all these new winemakers came in and they just took those little nuances that made it so successful, and they just blew it out of proportion. So in the 80s and the early 90s, Chardonnays from California were just like chewing on a stick of butter or a barrel of oak.
Or like licking a barrel.
Yeah, it was completely blown out and it was terrible. And France went in the other direction, and so Chardonnays from Burgundy are very minerally and kind of crisp and light. And so now the New World is starting to catch up to that again. And so this is actually a lot more pleasant than probably what they produced 20 years ago. And that's definitely the trend. You're right. So that's what you can expect from a Napa Valley Chardonnay. Chardonnay, probably it's the most widely planted grape in the world. And the version that California makes is the one that most people recognize when they smell it or taste it in the glass.
Right.
So anyway, there's
right.
your winner of the whites.
So that's the Chateau Montelena, the surprise winner of the white category in the tasting that Stephen Spurrier had put together to his chagrin. Now, which at this point he was, there's movies and books about it, so it's true at this point he was kind of regretting this. I mean, this was kind of backfiring. But they had the red category, and all the judges had been primed, and so they knew, got to select a red that's going to be from France right now, right? So here we go. We're going to do a tasting. We've got, again, 10 wines. We have 4 French red Bordeaux and 6 California Cabernet Sauvignon. They do the tasting. They do the rating. They tally the scores. And the winner was the 1973 Stag's Leap Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley.
Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. So, he just can't catch a break, the poor guy. But, in Bordeaux, on the left bank Bordeaux, as they say, Cabernet Sauvignon is the main grape that's used there, too. So that's, they usually blend it with Merlot. But, so it's no surprise they'd mashed it up with the California Cabernets. So right. It's just funny because to this day, like nowadays, no one would ever mistake a Napa Valley Cabernet for a Merlot. Ever. No. They taste completely different.
No.
But no. Apparently that wasn't the case in 1976.
No, and they have, tasting notes where one of the judges would taste a wine and say, "Oh, finally back to France," and it would be, one of the California wines. And so they were just so confused and mixed up, apparently. And yeah, and there was questions too, like, how could you not tell? How could you not tell? But I mean, at this point, the wines that they had selected from, some pretty high-end wineries out in California, they were copying the French style. So it would make sense that they would taste like French wines.
And we called them high-end. We called them high-end wineries, but no one had ever heard of them.
No.
They were skilled winemakers, no question.
Yes.
But still not on the map yet.
No. We can talk about that, but several of those winemakers of the winning wines went on to, found their own wineries and had great success with those too. So I mean, these were very skilled people just doing something that nobody had heard of. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So now again, remember, this was supposed to be a fun little event. It was not supposed to be a surprise. It was supposed to showcase French wines. Like this was not supposed to be something where California wines got famous. This was supposed to be to just point to France's wine dominance, right? And in fact, because nobody had expected this to be anything, no media even showed up that was invited, except for one journalist who was a foreign correspondent for Time magazine. His name was George Tabor. And he'd never even written about wine before. He just showed up because he was doing as a favor for his friend Stephen. And he was watching the proceedings and listening to what was going on. And even though he knew nothing about wine, he realized that this could be something, there was something special going on here.
It was a story.
So he wrote an article, 4 paragraphs long, and it was published the next week in Time magazine. And the headline was Judgment of Paris. And this 4-paragraph article in Time magazine literally changed the wine-making world forever.
Yeah.
This was the seminal moment for California winemaking. Everything changed. After this, investors started flooding into the area. Winemaking, people started buying it, selling it. There started to be collaborations between California winemakers and French winemakers. I mean, Napa became what we know of it today because of the Judgment of Paris.
And I didn't know that. That's a fun fact. I've heard the story before, but I didn't realize that it was actually the journalist that came up with the name that we're so familiar about hearing today.
Yep.
So that's great. Yeah. So yes, it's a dark day in French wine history for sure. And
poor Steven Spurrier. He was an outcast for a great long time.
Yeah,
he was kicked out of he was kicked out of
Paris.
He was blackballed. He was blackballed for multiple years.
Wow. So we've got the Montelena that won the white category, and then we've got the Stag's Leap wine cellars that won the red first place, right?
Yep.
I think most people have seen this or at least are familiar with the label. So let's talk about that one real quick. So this is okay. First of all, not the exact wine from the Judgment of Paris.
No.
All right, but same wine producer, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. There are 2 Stag's Leaps. There's one called Stag's Leap that has this large cursive writing, and then there's this one, Stag's Leap Wine Cellar. 2 different producers, they're in the same region. The name Stag's Leap actually comes from an old Native American legend about a stag escaping hunters that were chasing it by running through this gap in the rocks at the top of the mountain range that sits there above where the cellar is located. And in fact, the name Artemis here, which is this is a more recent wine that they've developed. Artemis is the Greek goddess of the hunt, so that's another kind of nod to the Stag's Leap legend. But
and the Judgment of Paris.
Well, that too. So but this again is, even though this isn't more of a high-end wine, it's kind of quintessential example of what you're going to get in a Napa Valley Cabernet. So I've got some in the glass right here, and you can see that it's just pitch dark. I mean, you can't see through that. That is opaque. And that's what you're going to get, because hot temperatures, ripe fruit, you're going to get very full-bodied dark wine. And it's going to be high in alcohol, again, because of the ripeness. Lots of sugar, turns into alcohol. It's going to be 14-15% almost all the time in a Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's going to smell and taste kind of like, it's going to smell like dried fruit or stewed fruit. I mean, you're going to get sort of that, dark cherries, and you're going to get some spices like cloves in there. Maybe it's a little smoky. You might even smell some chocolate in there. But, very bold and very intense. And that's not just the Cabernet Sauvignon grape itself, because if you go drink Cabernet from Chile or from Bordeaux, it's not going to be super bold and in your face like that. It's going to be more nuanced. California is not nuanced at all. It's very well balanced, and it's a high quality wine, and you can get it just about anywhere. It's a nice thing about Napa Valley wines. You can get them at just about any store in the world, or at least in the United States. And it's going to be a great pairing with, nice rich food for sure. Yeah. They're kind of tough to drink on their own as something to just sit around sipping on the deck, because they're so high
sipping wine.
Alcohol, and they're so bold. But, that's okay. To each their own, right? So
right.
Cabernet Sauvignon, like Chardonnay, they're both French grapes. Here's a little scientific fact for you, if you care. Cabernet Sauvignon is actually an offspring of two other grapes we've heard of, Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc. And so, those were bred together at some point in ancient wine history, and that's where Cabernet Sauvignon comes from. But again, French grape, most of the, 7 out of 8 of the international primary grapes all come from France. So it's not surprising that they were able to refine these over the years. It's not surprising that they were so confident in their own ability to make wine that they probably it never even occurred to them that they could lose a competition like this.
Well, and interestingly enough, so immediately it was, attempting to save face, and one of the judges tried to get her scorecard back because she didn't want it getting out what she had said about the different wines. She didn't. So then they went to, okay, well, these wines are not going to age well. They might be fine right now, but they're not like French wine. They're not going to age well. So they did a retasting 2 different times of the same wines that were in the 76 Judgment of Paris. Once 10 years later in 86, and then again in 2006. And the California wines won again. Another blind tasting, a retest of all the wines, conducted the same way. The California wines won again.
Amazing.
So I guess they do age well.
I guess so. So the Judgment of Paris, it's probably the most famous story in wine. I don't know. And but it was immortalized in a movie not that long ago called Bottle Shock. Chris Pine, Bill Pullman, and of course playing Stephen Spurrier, the inimitable Alan Rickman. So
yes.
Now, it's a good movie. It's fun to watch, and Stephen Spurrier is on record as saying that almost none of it is true.
Right.
But don't worry about that. It's still a fun movie, and I definitely recommend you go watch it. It's kind of one of those wine. If you want to watch wine movies, it's one of those top 5 that you have to see.
Yeah, it is entertaining. If you want something a little bit more accurate, George Tabor did write a book called The Judgment of Paris, and where he went through, all of the events that happened with the judgment, and so that, I think they even tried to make that into a movie, but it just got stalled. But that one's a little bit more accurate.
Gotcha. Well, you have to embellish it. You have to liven it up a little. Squeeze it into a 2-hour movie.
Although I think it's pretty lively. I know, but it's pretty lively considering what happened.
It's good stuff, and it's a good American success story. So you gotta love it. So this is great. Kind of a little intro to Napa Valley. A great story about how it became what it is today. We took a look at 2 of these wines, the 2 wines that really define Napa Valley, the 2 grapes anyway, Chardonnay.
Now you talked about,
Cabernet
you did talk
Sauvignon.
about what would pair with the red. What would pair with the white?
Just drink it with whatever you want. You know, I don't know. Sometimes I get a lot of people obsess about how do you pair this wine with this food, but the bottom line is you can have anything with almost anything. There are some rules about it, and some guidelines, and we should talk about those sometime. Because it's not so much the grape you're pairing with it as it is the characteristics, like how acidic it is.
Right. Well, that's what I was asking, because this one
is
these are pretty bold wines. So
yeah, they're and you don't want the wine to overpower the food, you know. But that's like a great topic for another show. We'll talk about that for sure, because there's a lot to go into there. And then we can have food on the show, which I've always wanted to do.
All right, keep your secrets.
So, just to wrap it up, one more fun factoid about Stephen Spurrier. So he died at the age of 80, and later in his career, after he kind of retired from the wine merchant business, he went back to England, and he started his own vineyard in the south of England, making amazing sparkling wines. Now, if you think about where grapes can grow in the world, it's usually between 30 and 50 degrees latitude, north or south, because it's a pretty small band. It's a narrow band of where the climate is right where grapes will grow. Yeah, England is kind of above that. It's a little bit north of that, and they don't really grow wine grapes in England, or at least they didn't used to. But the sparkling wines coming out of southern England are absolutely amazing. I've been lucky enough to taste a couple of them, and believe it or not, the reason they're so good really has to do with climate change. Mm-hmm. This is not just affecting where grapes can grow, but it's also it's had such an impact. If you ever doubt whether climate change is real, just go talk to a farmer. And that's what winemakers are.
Yeah.
They're farmers. And so not only is it expanding where grapes can grow and wine can be made, but it's having an effect on some of the most traditional winemaking areas in the world, like Bordeaux, who are actually changing some of their ancient rules to account for the changes in the world's climate. So that's another topic for another day. But suffice it to say, that was kind of a great way for Stephen Spurrier to end his career, making some amazing sparkling wines. If you can find them, they're not easy to find. It's not easy to find English wines in the U.S. But if you can find it, definitely pick one up and try it. They're not expensive either. It's not like spending $100 on a champagne. So
no, it's Bride Valley was his winery.
Thank you.
So if you can find any Bride Valley sparkling wines, definitely do it.
Yep. So on that note, I say we wrap it up for this week. Thank you, Stephen Spurrier, for your contribution to American wine.
Putting Napa Valley on the map. And and just one last thing on that, it didn't just put Napa Valley on the map. I mean, the whole premise behind French dominance was that there were no other areas that could grow worthy wine grapes. I mean, they just didn't have the environment, they didn't have the soil, all that kind of stuff. This was the leading thought of the time. And when they realized that this one area out in the middle of California could grow these spectacular wines, people started changing their minds on that. And they started realizing, well, wait a minute, we should look at other areas that have good conditions to grow grapes. And now we get excellent wines from New Zealand and Australia and South Africa and Chile and, the Pacific Northwest. I mean, it just really opened up worldwide.
It's the beginning of breaking the French monopoly on the fine wine world. Yep. So we could definitely thank him for that. And also Patricia.
Yeah, and Patricia, which she gets she gets a short shrift. So I want to make sure she got the credit for what she did.
Good job. All right, good, excellent. All right, so as always, hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks for being with us. If you have any comments or questions, please enter them. Hit the follow button, smash the like button until your finger hurts, and tell your friends. Because the more people we get watching, the more ideas we're going to have, and the more we're going to keep doing the show. We're on a good run. Let's keep it going.
Yeah.
All right. See you next time.